Hello and welcome back to Climbing Mount Sophia. Today I'm joined by Christopher Mastropietro. And Christopher has become a good friend to me, and I've learned a great deal from him. He's worked a good deal with John Vervaeke across a lot of video series. His conversations with John in the series After Socrates, and we'll play a bit in this conversation that follows. But this is a conversation that I think was a genuine Dialogos, virtually right from the beginning. And whenever I talk to Chris, I always start recording too late and find an intro to be sort of just an unnecessary burden. So I left it off at the start and recorded it later. So this was a tremendous adventure. For me personally, it was deeply helpful. And at the end, we looked through the eyes of Kierkegaard a good deal, and traveled aspects around faith, anxiety, despair, existential vertigo, infinite resignation, and talked about Abraham and Isaac. And then at the end, I sort of gave a rough sketch of a particular view into some of the deeper parts of theology from a particular perspective that should be taken with a great deal of sort of apophatic humility, I hope. So enjoy. The transitions between those chapters of life, whether it's the season of a year, whether it's the changing of the seasons or a changing of a life situation, or like those transitions can be so difficult to navigate, I find.
Yeah, they really can. I agree. And they produce a kind of the instability of them. It's not always conscious. Sometimes it's not, but there's a certain anxiety, there's a certain there's a restlessness. I don't know what it is. I don't even know how to name it, but you can just tell inside your body when you're on sure footing and when you're not. When you're not, it's almost as though you're in. Have you ever been in one of those sort of like illusion museums where you have sort of the floor on a tilt? Yeah, it's like that.
Yes. I've been listening this morning on my drive to the gym and back, and then I had a little bit of time before you came on. So I've been watching the first conversation that you and John had for After Socrates, which is, I mean, all of those conversations are amazing, but I've listened to that one so many times because every time I do it, I sort of see it from a different angle. And there was a line in there, something about the vertigo of despair, maybe.
Vertigo of freedom, I think.
Yeah. Maybe it's something like that sort of feeling that you're talking about, like, strikes me like that. Because you do have, maybe the vertigo of freedom is a good one, because it is in the, maybe that's part of what it is, because when you're changing that context and when all of that perspectival shift happens in that just change of a chapter or a change of a season, like, you do have this new, it's like there's this new angle that comes available to you.
Yeah.
And that, it's funny because when I was thinking about what I wanted to talk to you about today, there's always so many different things that come to mind with that, but like I've been finding myself in that transition state, like, repeatedly. Like there's this Kierkegaardian kind of repetition that I'm experiencing with that, especially since my daughter's been born. And it's like I keep returning to these different aspectual layers of this chapter transition, and that vertigo. Yeah, wow. So that's really cool. So it's like, even this first thing that we're bringing up just sort of from our own personal narratives has really landed for me.
So how do you experience that repetition? What is it? What is it that's repeating? in the repetition for you?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know. I mean, that my first response is that's probably the right question to ask that I haven't been asking.
Do you find that you're coming upon the same? Are you finding yourself in the same state? Are you coming upon the same dilemma? Do you find that you're having to make the same decision repeatedly in order to consecrate the decision? What is the thing that you come upon such that you say, "Oh, I was already here, and here I am again"? What is the thing that's already here?
Yeah, it's some sort of like existential vertigo.
Yeah.
It's this like it's this. So I just finished reading Fear and Trembling. I got Fear and Trembling 3 weeks ago by Kierkegaard, and I've read it twice. And
that's pretty good. 3 weeks, you read it twice?
Well, it's sort of, yeah. I mean, I've sort of been obsessed with this idea of faith for a couple of years now. And, of course, I never spent time looking at Abraham in that for no reason at all. But it's like one of those things. As soon as Kierkegaard starts talking about it, you're like, oh, yeah, probably should have thought about Abraham in this question of what is faith. But there's something in like, so his idea of infinite resignation has been a lot of how I've, like, when he talks about the move of infinite resignation, that seems to be the way I've been responding to these sort of moments of like existential vertigo, nausea, like absurdity, like, where am I? Like, how do I fit into my own life? Like, how am I possibly these two, like, or this multitudinous specialization of a person? Like, how I like that's what comes into question for me. And I feel like that idea of sort of infinite resignation has been the way that I've found to get out of that. But I'm like this going further into faith that he's going on about, right? Like, first of all, I don't know what he means. Like I think I do. Like, I get glimpses of it, but
what do the glimpses look like? Or where do you find yourself when the glimpses happen?
It's like when you're in that place of the infinite resignation, and then there's this it's like you stand on the ground of the infinite resignation, and then you sort of live your life. But that doesn't feel like it adequately is sort of putting it into words. But it's like once that sort of mode of participation, that is at least what I'm trying to refer to, or what I think he might be referring to with the infinite resignation, like if that is already in place, then there's this like field of being yourself that opens, that's not there otherwise. And I'm wondering if that's what he means when he talks about that the individual must be in absolute relation to the universal, and then become an individual again. It's almost like this: you have the individual, you have the universal, and as the ethical, and you have to fully relate there. But then once you fully relate there, you can sort of go beyond it. Is that?
Yeah, I think it's something like that. I think it's the idea that you need to sort of pass through the universal before, right? You need to resign before the knighthood of faith becomes available. Insofar as we can think of these things sequentially. I mean, it's a very kind of it's an approximate way of thinking about it, because there's a way in which these things aren't sequential in the way that I think we feel they are, or they're not sequential in the way that we conceptualize the sequence of things. But I think that's a way of thinking about them that you need to that I mean, I always think of it as being, I always think of the resignation as being a kind of abstraction away from the worldly,
Mm,
and
mm,
almost a kind of Stoic fatalism. And I think
mm,
that's it's helpful to me to think of the infinite resignation as a kind of Stoic fatalism,
mm,
as a kind of coming to. I like your image of sort of settling to the bottom somewhere. I think
mm-hmm,
of almost
mm-hmm,
settling to the bottom of an
mm-hmm.
ocean bed, which
Yeah.
is to say that you let yourself pass through the film
Mm-hmm.
of life and through the
Yeah.
worldly. You find yourself settling somewhere that is not a place of your own will. It's sort of it's it's somewhere that you naturally land in virtue of being the kind of thing that you are. And then by being the kind of thing that you are and resigning yourself to almost the fatalism of that, you gain a kind of capacity for participation again. And that, the way I kind of think of it is, you
Well, I'm almost picturing, if I can throw out a picture and see if I'm with you.
yeah,
I'm sort of picturing like if your life is sort of, a hologram, or like as you and John talk about in that conversation, it's sort of a dream woven by a dream weaver. And if that, I was sort of picturing that as a hologram, and it's sort of like your will is the thing structuring and holding that, and this settling down. I almost experience that settling down as my will, like coming down to the bottom of things and coming to rest. Is that?
yeah, it's almost as though you're sort of you're giving up something in order to gain it again, um, which is your participation in yourself. And of course, the move from resignation to faith is sort of like, realizing that participating in yourself and participating in God are one, right? That your identity, it's like there's a kenosis, there's an emptying of oneself in order for one's identity to be properly continuous with God. And that the knight of faith realizes that his identity grounds in God, and he only participates in virtue of that relationship. That is all that he is, in some
Mm,
sense,
mm,
right? And there's a resigning of himself
yeah.
in order for himself to be properly filled with that which is his nature. And his nature grounds in exactly one place. But he must resign himself in that individual sense in order to gain that self back. It doesn't mean that he's no longer an individual, but that his individual identity, his individual being, grounds out in the being that the being that, in virtue of which he is the being that he is. And that the surrendering of any idea that he is autonomous, that he has independence,
Mm,
is necessary before he can make the move back. I think of it basically as a keel backward, so that then he can keel forward again. Think of it that way, right?
and is it sort of, is it the absoluteness of that keel backwards, like the absoluteness of that surrender, that sort of like, in a sense, prohibits you from making any, let's use the word, cataphatic statement
Yeah,
about the move of faith?
I think it is. I think that's actually a really good way of putting it. Yeah, yeah. I think it's, well, his phrase, right? The absolute relation to the absolute, um, and there's I think my reading of that, at least, is that resignation has to be utterly complete. in order for the movement of faith to be possible, right?
Mm-hmm.
I must resign absolutely in order for faith to become available to me. And I can't rest in the resignation, right? The resignation is not the landing place, but the resignation is the preparedness for
So
faith.
so that's a weird one for me. I'm curious to hear more about that. Like, because in that, like, how did you say it? The total resignation, but you don't rest there.
Yeah, but by that I just mean that the resignation is not. I don't think for him the resignation is not the goal. The resignation is not.
Mm-hmm.
That's not the final move.
Right.
I mean, I
right.
think that's where his criticism of the Stoics comes into play, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Because for him, it's sort of like, I almost think of Kierkegaard as marching in stride with the Stoics and going, yes, 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 yes,
Yeah.
absolutely not. Right?
Yeah.
Because right, it's almost as though
Get a picture of like him and Marcus Aurelius walking arm in arm.
yeah,
And then sort
walking,
of this confrontation at the end.
affably in stride. I don't know that he ever did anything affably, but marching affably in stride, and then at some point, he just sort of turns abruptly, shakes his hand, and then walks away.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because then Kierkegaard would say, "Yes, yes, yes," but then Jesus Christ,
right. Yeah. Well, and that's, I think,
putting it like, it's me being silly, but in a way, I think that's kind of it, right?
Yeah.
Which is to say, like, you forego a certain amount of possibility because of being the finite thing that you are, in all of the ways that he and the Stoics in spirit, I think, agreed on.
Yeah.
But then I think the final moves he makes is, but what you have to realize is that in God and for God, all things are possible.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the final move.
That's
the final move. Now that's it's all well and good to just sort of express that. But I think for him, the reality, the reality of that absolution is properly inexpressible. And I think that coming into stride with that absolution is something like what he means by the knighthood of faith. That's Abraham.
Okay. So when you were the difficulty I feel like that I experience, and that I also sort of conceptually was struggling with, there was when I attempt to do that move of total resignation, there seems to be inherent in the total resignation a sense of total resting, or at least a willingness to totally rest there, or something. And I don't, and that's what sort of gave me pause. It's sort of like, well, how do you infinitely resign but not be content in that resignation? That almost seems like a thing that has to go together. But maybe you answered that. I felt like maybe that's the thing of saying, yes, but with God all things are possible. Is that the way out of that?
I think so. I think so. I mean, saying that is that the way out of that makes it sound like it's like you paint yourself in a corner just to try and escape it. And I don't think that's exactly it. I think it's much more like it's a dialectic, right? It's like the move of resignation is actually a movement toward faith in itself, sorry, I accidentally muted myself. Even though it's a movement away, it's also a movement toward. And I think that's what's dialectical about it, right? Because he describes faith as this sort of bidirectional movement. So take this image of someone sort of abstracting away, keeling backwards, removing oneself from the flow and participation of life. And then in virtue of removing oneself, in virtue of keeping your attention in a certain place, your movement away actually turns out to be a movement back toward yourself, back toward life, back toward the living of it, which is made possible by a kind of recommitment to the earthly, not on earthly terms, right?
Right.
So there's this idea in faith that, I find it similar in some ways to how sort of to how more Eastern traditions describe enlightenment, which is to say, I can take up a broom and sweep the floor and be perfectly, perfectly contented and at peace, and find in that mere action an absolute world of meaningfulness. And I think Kierkegaard's knighthood of faith is very similar to that, right? I can go home and greet my family and to outward appearances be exactly the same as I was.
Yeah.
And yet every movement is then a movement of faith because it is impregnated with the possibility that only God can seed.
Yeah.
And it is continuous with the identity that he provides. And because of that, I have this, I'm speaking from my understanding of Kierkegaard. I'm not speaking from like an enlightened perspective, believe me, but I'm not speaking from experience. But I think that that's very much the idea that this movement is made invisibly, but it's a movement that's made from the individual to everything that is prior to that individual. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
So it's a tough thing to understand, Ken. Like this is, I mean, even for me, like I find it's one of those things that it's like I get, as you say, a glimpse of, and then it slips through again, and I reacquire a glimpse, and it slips through, and I reacquire it, and it slips through. I think it's a very tough thing to understand, and I think the reason for that is that it's something that is a glimpse in a mode of experience.
Right. And that's what I'd like to focus on is like when you're trying to actually, because I assume, I think I know you well enough to assume this, I hope, but that when you're trying to follow Kierkegaard, like you're actually trying to make the movements with him, at least in some sense, like sort of existentially, phenomenologically. Like, do you try to do that, like as like a serious play with it?
I don't know. Well, I mean, yes and no. I certainly follow the turns of his imagination. I try and follow his thinking. I allow myself to be provoked by his provocation, but follow him in the sense that by tracing his footfalls, do I find myself acquiring the very thing that he is, trying to teach. I don't know. I think like, I mean, he's a, to me, he's I don't, how do I put this? I find in him, I don't find that the real possibility of faith, the real possibility of that movement, to me, doesn't reveal itself in him, but reveals itself in other things, but very much as a consequence of everything that I learned from him. So I don't find that, I think it's because to me, I think it's much simpler than and I think it is for him too. Like there's an immense complexity in his writing and in his thinking, just to try and change the way that we use our language to bend ourselves around certain ideas of what's real. And he has to do a lot with language to make those moves, to bend his thinking and bend ours as we read him. But the bending of thinking, I don't think is I think it is a kind of preparation, right? It's aphoretic, right? Like he to me, he induces a lot of aporia, because he takes the structures, the let's say the routine structures of thought, and sort of turns them turns them against one another, turns them in on themselves, right? And he does things that are so provocative that I think they're meant in a very Socratic way to kind of induce that aporia. And I mean, even in Fear and Trembling, just as you've read, like he does that with Abraham, right? That's the whole point. Like he shows that there's something inherently aphoretic about the Abrahamic story, the Abraham and Isaac story, that defies comprehension. But its absurdity, what I think one of the things that he's trying to show is that the very absurdity, the incomprehensibility of Abraham's actions is something that we have to pass through. We have to confront it and reckon with it very seriously. We have to reckon with that absurdity, and we have to reckon with the fact that there is something in the nature of faith that is inexpressible and incomprehensible in the way that we're accustomed to expressing and comprehending. And then unless we understand it in those terms, we're not going to be able to follow its footsteps. It's not a how-to. Like, I don't think he's trying to say, here's how you become a knight of faith, maybe notionally, but he's not trying to provide a kind of a step-by-step. He doesn't think of it that way. I just don't think he does, right? He's not programmatic. Like, he's not a programmatic thinker. At least not in those works. You know, his edifying discourses, I think, are a little bit more pedagogical in the classical sense. But his pseudonymous works are works of absolute, almost literary provocation to take the way we think about things and turn them in on themselves and to turn them inside out and to foist us with the responsibility of reckoning with the fact that we don't understand them.
So in a sense, are they... Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, please.
Well, I was going to ask, like, in this sense, is he almost... So this is a way to say what I'm trying to get at. Like, I find myself like taking versions of myself, like particular parts of me. Let's say, to use sort of IFS language, like taking parts of me, and when I'm participating as that part, when I find myself participating as that part, trying to find... They're almost like rituals, but maybe almost like intellectual rituals or pathways to walk down such that part sort of bottoms itself out and flips me into that state of aporia from the standpoint of that part, so that it can open up to becoming more than it was, and maybe that's his point, that all of our parts need to come into absolute relation. In that sense, like sort of bottom out and make the move of infinite resignation. Maybe that's a random tangent there, but
yeah, I mean, I don't know that he thinks of things in parts in the way that something like IFS would arrange it, but I think that for him there is I think for him, coming into a relationship with the good, coming into a relationship with God in the matter of faith, is a kind of coming to unity. I think that's I think that's very clear and very, very explicit, right? And this idea that only by rejoining to that which is prior to me and that upon which my being is based, do I come together as one and find myself properly rejoined to the very thing that gives me my identity. And so there's a kind of, that anything that doubles us or triples us, anything that multiplies us, anything that multiplies our attention, that multiplies our will, that fans us out and disperses us in time and in thought, is despair. And that the goal of faith is a kind of regathering, right? Think of the Logos, right? It's a regathering into unity. And that unity is a matter of will, and that unity is a matter of relation. And so, but for him, the only place, I think of it as a place, however we conceive of it, the only place where that unity is rediscovered, recollected, if you would, is at the ground, right? Is the good itself. And And that I think we can, the way I think of it is I think of the movement of faith as being very much a kind of coming back together into unity. And that's why there's a simplicity to it, right? That's why there's a simplicity to the singularness of attention. I think that, yeah.
So when he's doing, like when you were talking about him bending language, right, and he's going to these great lengths, like if I guess I'm picturing like that ground, that center, that unity point, if that's the, if that's the center of a sphere, and the further you move out on the sphere, the more you move into human abstraction, or we could call it the Tower of Babel, maybe. And like, if you're way out here, or if you're trying, if you find aspects of yourself being far away from that center, like you have to trace somehow all the way back. And is that what he's doing? Like when he's writing on the level that he is and thinking on the level that he is, because I mean, he says he talks about how he understands Hegel better than he understands the story of Abraham in Fear and Trembling. He's sort of like, I feel like I actually can say I get Hegel. Like, maybe not, but I think I get Hegel, but like I have no idea what's going on with Abraham. And I mean, obviously he's writing under a pseudonym and those kinds of things. But is that sort of what he's getting at? Is like, I find myself able to understand Hegel, which means I'm way out here from the center. Like my intellectual capabilities can take me far into abstraction, and somehow even that version of myself must find its way back.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. I like that. I think because I think he feels that, philosophy in at least in the Hegelian tradition, and very much in the tradition of his day, was something that he thought had virtually no relationship to faith.
Yeah, he says that. He's like, well, you guys, you all mastered faith apparently because you think you've gone far beyond it.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, his critique of that is famous for a reason, right? He sort of looks at these sort of towering intellectual architectures and looks at it and goes, okay, well, great. So what?
Yeah.
Well done. I mean, what a wonderful display of your intellect, but what's it for? What does it do to me? What does it do for you? Right? How does it affect the movement that must be made in order for one to come into contact with what's most real? Show me that it does this.
Yeah. Was he the one who said that Hegel built his philosophy and then sat down beside it?
Yeah, absolutely. That was him. And which kind of tells you everything you need to know about what he thinks, right? I mean, I think it's
profoundly unsatisfying.
And I think for him, I mean, he talks about philosophy in that kind of philosophy in that Enlightenment tradition as being a kind of objective enterprise, in the sense that it's sort of seeking a worldly object to understand, but that Christianity as a subjective is a subjective reality, meaning it is of significance to the subject. It is the thing that weighs the world and gives it its gravity, gives it its import, makes it real, makes it felt and affective and visceral, and right. It's like, and I mean, the general. I mean, I don't think that perspective needs to be argued for very forcefully, because I mean, just look at how irrelevant philosophy is to most people.
Yeah. Well,
I mean, all of the intellectual. All of the intellectual posturing and all of the intellectual conversation, what do they amount to for most people? Very, very, very little of existential bearing, right?
I've had and I say that times
with due affection for philosophical conversations, but I mean, do they remake the world for the person? Not generally, no.
Yeah.
Right? And can a person have a meaningful, a really beautiful, meaningful existence without ever coming into contact with the history of ideas? Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Right.
And I think that's kind of what Kierkegaard's doing in a way, right? Because he's conversant. He can play that game, and he can play it as well as anybody has ever been able to play it.
Yeah.
And yet he plays it in some ways to refer away from it again.
Right.
I love that move.
Which is what ancient philosophy sought to do. Right. I
Yeah,
mean,
I think at its best
that's
it did.
that philosophy is lived, not, I mean, I'm trying to think of the quote from Hadot and the Stoics and all those things, but that idea that like, philosophy is a way of life. That's what it is. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I just did a sort of a humorous aspect of what you're saying there is I've had several experiences this summer where I've been in conversation with someone in sort of just a relatively structured societal context with a person serving me a drink behind a bar, that kind of thing, the teller at the grocery store, and just sort of fall into conversation with them and ask a question, a what is question. Like on one occasion I was getting a cider at a cider place, and the name of the cider was Freedom. And one option was Freedom, and one option was Glory. And those were the names of their ciders. And it was a fascinating experience. I asked the guy who owned the place, he was there, and he said, yeah, they do attempt to taste the cider and try to match it to some word that they've pulled out of the United States Constitution that they feel sort of symbolizes something about what it means to be American. So they try to taste their cider and associate it with which word fits best, and then serve that. I thought it was really cool. And so I asked, I said, well, what do you think freedom is? Like, what is freedom? And we went back and forth maybe 2 times, and then and they were very engaged. And then all of a sudden there was like this moment where they're like, nope. And they said, wow, this is getting like really philosophical. And then they turned and walked away. And I thought, oh, wow. It's like, that's just a layer we don't go to.
No. Yeah, that's interesting. I wonder which cider is sweeter, the Freedom or the Glory.
Yeah. I think I tried them both. I don't remember. I feel like the Glory was, but it's been a month or 2 now, so I'm not sure. But
okay. Glory, that's interesting. And it's Glory. That doesn't surprise me, actually. That kind of tracks.
Yeah.
It's interesting. No, I know. I've had that experience too. I mean, as a rule, I try not to create philosophical conversations with people that I don't know very well, because I find that it immediately somehow alienates people. And I think I think you can have a very philosophical conversation that's smuggled under the guise of a completely different kind of conversation. Those are the ones that I like. I mean, I love having them, like I am with you right now. Like I love having them with people who we can decide to play a particular kind of game and doing that. And there's an irony to that, which I really like. We understand that when we're having a philosophical conversation, we're not actually, there's a particular kind of thing that we're doing when we do that. And there's a playfulness to it.
Mm-hmm.
And I enjoy that a lot when philosophical conversations are just playful, and they're in a sense, there's a certain looseness to them. Mm-hmm. And I like that. But I think that to have a really meaningful philosophical conversation with someone who wouldn't ordinarily be disposed to do that, I think there are all kinds of ways of doing that without having to name it as such.
Right.
Because I think as soon as you name it as such, first of all, you've revealed something that I think is best concealed in order to be made most real. And there's a right time for that. And also, I think that when people hear that word, they think, oh, well, now you're talking about a specific discipline with specific knowledge requirements. And I don't have those knowledge requirements, and I haven't read these books. And so I have nothing to contribute. And all I'm going to do is feel alienated by it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that's just often how it is.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that doesn't mean they don't have anything to contribute.
Of course.
It really
of course.
doesn't. They often do, right? They've often had thoughts that have names in a tradition, but they don't know what those names are. And they don't matter, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And
this is one of the most difficult, like, existential things for me is, like, I will have, because I'm really interested in the Socratic seduction, right? This, you don't name it. You just have, you're sort of in the place doing the thing in your normal life such that it happens without needing to be named, without needing to be referenced to some, I don't need to reference to Kierkegaard. I don't need to reference to Socrates. We're just doing the thing.
Yeah.
And sometimes I watch myself in my life and see that happening, and it's thrilling. And then other times I watch myself trying to do it and find myself in these sort of alienating kind of situations like you bring up, which causes so much like just a negative energy thing. And that whole journey has been wild.
So do you mean instances where you've fallen into conversations with people and you've tried to do something Socratic, you've tried to sort of smuggle a philosophical conversation under a different name, and that you've had experience of that have been both very gratifying and meaningful, and also experiences of that have taken turns that you've regretted or that you haven't felt were worthwhile?
Yeah, it's almost like, except it doesn't feel like there's as much intention as maybe is implied with the smuggling metaphor. It's sort of like you just sort of find yourself
it sounds duplicitous, and I don't mean it that way.
Yeah,
I mean it
right.
in the sense, I understand. You're not coming in with a hidden agenda.
Right. But then if I do, right, or if as a conversation starts, here's how it usually happens for me. It's like I'll be in a conversation with someone and an opportunity will present itself. Let's call it a trailhead. And instead of just sort of like, gesturing toward it and maybe going a few paces and waiting to see if the other person would like to join me, I sort of like throw us onto the trailhead, and, walk us too far enough down the path that the other person says, I don't want to be here.
Mm-hmm. Does that mean, is that because you veered that person away from their natural interest? You've then pulled them into a place where they don't want to be. And that's different than stepping into somebody else's sphere of interest and working with that, which is how those things usually work better, which is, this is what you're interested in. I'm going to step into it with you. I'm going to inquire into it. I'm going to inquire into your interest, but I'm going to inquire into it in such a way that maybe we can explore what guides the interest, what it's made of. And maybe we'll only get so far, but maybe we will get somewhere interesting. It really depends, doesn't it? I've had both versions of that too. And you can only do so much. And
what do you do with that? Like when you find yourself in that, right? Or you watch yourself doing that, like how do you work with that?
As a rule, I try not to. Oh God, each one is different. As a rule, I try not to have a conversation that I don't think has a chance of I follow it until I feel it chilling, and then I back off, and I try and back off before it chills. And I try not to insinuate things into it that aren't already naturally occurring features of a particular topic or a particular person's interest. So if I think someone's comfortable with this, I'm happy to work within it. But I'll ask about it, and I'll ask after it, and I'll prod it a little bit. And I'll prod it until maybe they realize that there's a bit of prodding going on. And I don't mind that, as long as the prodding is actually good-natured. And as long as the prodding is revealing the fact that, hey, I'm actually interested. I'm interested in your interest. That the thing that really kind of, I'm interested in people's interest. And I'm interested in what guides it and what it's made of. And generally, I find a lot of people are quite they're sort of gratified and surprised to be asked about the things that command their attention most. And sometimes and sometimes they're not receptive, and that's fine, and I let it go. But if they are, I find, to me, that's the way in. I try not to shift the focus. I try not to shift the topic or the subject. I stay with it. I stay with it. I stay with it. I stay with it. And if it's going to change, let it change naturally. But what I find doesn't work very well is to take this and to very consciously use it as a segue to shifting attention over to something else. I don't think that works very well. But I think that if I feel the person is really not willing, then why bother? Why bother? Right. I think, I don't know. I felt a long time ago, I just sort of decided that I wouldn't venture headlong into conversations that I didn't think had a chance of producing something meaningful. Between the two of us. And if I don't sense that that's possible, or if that seems foreclosed, then I don't go there, because
we would all be a lot better off if we did that.
Well, because I want to preserve the possibility. I think for every person, not for every person, but because we're all disposed so differently, we all have our tics, we all have our quirks. We all have these little temperamental sensitivities. We all are receptive to certain things and not receptive to other things. It takes a long time to figure out, to map those things about a person. You need to get to know somebody pretty well to know what commands their attention and how to play within it and how to work with it. And I think you don't know that about a stranger very well. Even an acquaintance, you don't always know that. And so I don't want to follow something. I don't want to push in too far if by pushing in, I'm going to actually foreclose something for the future. I don't want to create a chilling effect. I'd rather work with what is given and what is permitted. And that's, we're just talking about sort of what we're talking about right now is a specific mode of conversation, right? It's sort of like a politely Socratic, playful conversation. A debate is something different, right? Or when you decide, okay, no, we're gonna be in opposition about something, and that's the game we're playing. And it's just about what kind of game you're playing, right?
And
not
having a sensitivity,
one for another, confusing one for another. I think is critical, because sometimes you can start in one place and realize, oh, this game is actually changing into a different one. Do I want to go here? Do I want to play this one? Maybe I do. Is it worth it? Right. And I better really think about whether this is worthwhile going here. And sometimes, in my experience, sometimes it is, and the vast majority of time it's not. And so anyway, that's generally how I try to approach these things. Not perfectly. That's the goal, let's say. I find myself breaking that rule periodically, obviously. But generally I think, okay, is there a chance that this could yield something of value for the two of us? If there is, it's probably worth tentatively venturing into. And if I find that it's changing from under my feet, okay, then I have to decide, okay, is it worth doubling down and really going somewhere different? Or am I just going to gently back away and save this for another day?
That's a beautiful goal. I think that was really beautifully said. I think, just sort of like putting myself up to that perspective. It's like, man, I think my ego just gets in the way so often.
It does for most of us. It does for most of us. No, it does. It's hard sometimes not to, especially when someone says something that you just, I think the hardest thing is, if you've put, and I'm sure I've been on both sides of this equation, as most of us have, there are things that sometimes someone will throw a statement out And it may relate to something you've spent many, 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 many hours and days thinking about. And you know that person hasn't, because it's just not of interest to them in the way that it is to you. Nevertheless, they assert something, they opine, right, very affirmatively in a way that just chafes against all of the hours that you've spent poring over this topic. Well, what do you do with that, right?
Right.
What do you do with that?
Right.
Right? Do you decide, okay, I'm gonna set about to, you know what I mean? I'm gonna say my piece and I'm gonna stand firm. Okay, great. But then what is that? What's that project? Why are you undertaking it? Is this just an involuntary fit of ego? Right? Is this like an incontinent? Is this just spilling out of you because you're frustrated? Or are you trying to achieve something? Right? Am I trying to just overwhelm this person with, am I trying to overwhelm this person with all of the thinking that I've done about this just to show them that I've done it?
Yeah.
Do I actually want to affect some change in their perspective? Do I think it's possible? Right? What am I trying to do? What's the intentionality of this exercise? Right?
Yeah.
And I think we often, I'm including myself in this, I have moments of this like everyone does, right? Where the reflex comes.
Yeah.
Someone says something, it touches a nerve, you're provoked, you end up saying something forcefully, and then before you know it, you're in an interaction, you're thinking, how did I get here?
Yeah.
I should have just kept my mouth shut, and then sometimes I think that I'm going to step in very carefully and do something delicate, and then I think, you know what, to hell with it. I'm going to throw this down. I'm going to see what happens. I think purposefulness, I think is really important. And I don't, and I don't think it's a bad thing every once in a while, even if it's just an exercise to I think, especially if it's a reflective exercise, to see and examine what happens to you in one of these interactions, provided you're not being too careless and reckless and
right.
But I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing all the time to decide to play a more aggressive game in a conversation. I think that's okay. I think you just need to know what kind of game you're playing. And what you hope to achieve by it, and what it's actually doing for you and doing for the other person. I think there are so many different ways, right? There's the careful Socratic inquiry. There's the actual Dialogos, right? Which, as we know, is a very different kind of game. There's something more like debate. There's something a little bit more provocative and aggressive and confrontational. I think all of these things have their value, and all of them have their place. I think the art and the craft of this is understanding when to offer each of these games, to whom, in what circumstances, under what conditions, and to begin to read those conditions a little bit more observantly, right? And I think that's just becomes a matter of practice and intuition. And I think it's by nature, it's imperfect, and it will always be a little clumsy. And I think all of us have found ourselves in all of these different games not having intended to be there. And but I think that's the goal, at least. If I had to articulate the goal, which is not always achieved, is, here are the variety of different modes of conversation that involve grappling with certain ideas. How do I pay as much attention as I can to the person and to the manner of the person as it's being presented to me? And weigh that against everything that is coming up in me when I confront this person, and find myself into the particular kind of game that is going to have the most enriching, that is most needful at that moment. And that's not, that makes it sound like it's kind of a logical calculation. It's not. It's much more. I think it's much more intuitive. It's much more spontaneous.
It's much more like sparring, right? It's much more like, because I feel like this has been a really good, like, sort of clear path that you've walked through the various manners of posturing yourself in interactions. such that you can open ground for the logos, right? Such that you can attempt to midwife. And there's various postures that become available. And there's a correct move. There's a correct block for this one. And there's a correct, there's one optimal move. And even when you don't make the optimal move, even when you find yourself, you're halfway into the kick and you realize you really, really should have thrown up a block, right? You're about to take one to the chin. And as you're doing that, you recognize that there's a meta move you can make. And the meta move is to become aware of the fact that you're playing this game. You're not like, that's actually, that matters. It's not like that doesn't matter, but what really matters on the higher level is that you are learning how to, this is meta optimal grip, I think. Mm-hmm. Like you're learning, and you can turn this into, as much as this is going to be a painful experience, you can turn it around into a way of mapping how and when to engage.
Yeah. I think what you're describing, that's very well said. I think what you're describing is, Peterson actually has a really good argument about this exact topic, which I think he calls the game versus the game of games, and that the goal of each game, the most optimal goal and outcome for each game that you play is to afford invitation to the greatest number of possible games, something like that, right? Mm-hmm. Like what I ultimately want to, do I want to win this particular game? Well, yeah, maybe, but not if winning this game is going to ultimately come at the cost, is going to cost me the opportunity to participate in the widest number of possible games. Because what's my goal, right? Is it the Philonikeia, right? Or do I want to win? Do I want to assert myself at all possible costs, or do I actually want to be better at being myself? And that sounds high-minded, and I don't pretend for a second that I always, choose the high-minded road, nor do most of us. But I think the idea is that this interaction is not an isolated interaction. This feeds back into the rest of my life. This feeds back into the rest of your life, right? Mm-hmm. This is continuous with all kinds of other interactions that each of us are going to have. Okay, how does then that feedback happen? When I return this back into the rest of my life, how does it fit? What does it look like? How has it contributed to the continuum of interactions that I have with other people and with myself? And I think that, how does this part fit into the whole? How is it contributing to the whole? And I think that's sometimes the thing that it's harder to pay attention to that in the moment, because you think, well, no, I'm just in the moment. This is, and sometimes I think you do need to just sort of surrender that programmatic thinking and just sort of surrender yourself to the moment. But I think, as with most things, there is a kind of optimal balance between having a higher order perspective that understands this as being a part of a greater number of interactions, and allowing yourself the spontaneity to simply plug into the moment and to respond to what it instinctively requires of you, and to toggle as deftly as you can between them. Because if there's one thing, like, whether they come back in a straightforwardly causal way or not, every single interaction we have with another person is significant in the grand scheme of things. Every single one. And we don't always know how. And again, sometimes it's directly causal and sometimes it's not. But everything that we do is done to us, right? That's what, like, that the sort of the reflexive reality of our actions in the world, and conversations with people are one of the most impactful forms of action in the world. Every single thing is reflexive. What we do is done to us, right? Immediately, not not across time, but in the
Right.
moment. So how do we treat those in the way that they ought to be treated? And that doesn't always mean delicately or gingerly.
Yeah.
Sometimes there is a toughness to it, but I think the goal is to just become conscious of the nature of each of these games and what we're doing when we play them, and to try them play them in such a way that the sort of the higher order perspective is always somehow attended to, whether directly or not.
Well,
Sorry,
there's
Ken, that was a bit of a
no, it was wonderful. No, that is wonderful. That was great. I mean, there were several points I was sort of wanting to jump in, but
Go for it. Yeah, I know.
Well, one of the things is that, there's only so many layers you can play at one time. And like when you find yourself pulled into a moment and you live at that level for a while, and then when you get a chance for reflection and you look back at yourself and how you operated through that experience, through that interaction, and I often will find myself frustrated by the lack of awareness that I held in that moment, and perceive it to have been possible that if I had had a higher level of awareness in that moment, I could have averted some sort of pain or whatever, or it could have been better. And then I find myself creating a tension towards myself, across time then. And so, but what does seem to be effective in coming out of that is this sort of, well, maybe this is like what we were talking about toward the beginning with that sort of infinite resignation, that move toward a resigning of the knowledge of good and evil, to say that I should have been able to have that capacity in that moment, and to presume that in fact the highest good wasn't served by my dropping down to that level, even though from my standpoint, my ability to measure, it's sort of like recognizing that no matter when you measure, it's too soon.
Say that again.
No matter when you measure, it's always too soon.
When you measure,
mm-hmm.
It's too soon. Yeah, it's hard to know what to do with that sometimes. You have an interaction, doesn't go the way you hoped, the way you would have wanted it to, and you just sort of look back at it and you go, "Oh, that was foolish."
Right.
Maybe I said too much. Maybe I said too little. Maybe I needed to assert something when I didn't, or maybe I did when it wasn't necessary, and it was just like an impulse of the ego. And you look back, and we can all look back and do that, right? And go, but then knowing what to do with that becomes a tricky business, because on the one hand, you might say, well, I can just sort of take these as lessons and be more conscious and just sort of improve things. And there's a sort of straightforward pedagogical value that, these interactions have. And that's all well and good. But then there's something more interesting to me about it, which is that, the conditions that we find ourselves in, the person that we find ourselves opposite, draws things out of us that cannot be drawn by other conditions, by other circumstances, right? It's always amazed me. It's like one of the most fascinating things I think I experience in my life, the way that specific relationships draw. I feel as though I'm ultimately a different person of me is drawn out by different people. And there's a is there a continuity? Yeah, I hope so. But there are also like these very, as used to use your word from earlier, these different aspectualizations.
Yeah.
That are drawn out opposite a set of conditions that put certain kinds of constraints on the scope of a possible interaction. When I'm sitting opposite you, there are things I'm going to be able to say to you, ways I'm going to be able to react to you that are not going to be available to me unless I want to completely break the spell of a container.
Right.
that are not going
Right.
to be available to me in other circumstances.
Right. Right.
So to each relationship, to each container created by each individual interaction, there is sort of already a set of constraints placed upon it. And I think that conversing wisely within the container of a specific relationship requires an attunement to the kind of container it is, what it affords, what it doesn't afford, what the possibilities of it and necessities of it are. And that means that knowing how to converse with a person properly requires an understanding of the kind of relationship that you're in, how elastic it is, how it bends, how it yields, and how it doesn't yield. What the affordances are, in other words, for any given container.
Yeah.
And if we could know that, if we could truly comprehensively know that, of course we can't, right? We can't know that because knowing it involves testing it. We push against it. We stretch inside of it. That's how we understand the geometry of the container of a particular relationship, right? You know, we don't see it omnisciently. We experience it from within. It's an embodied relationship.
It's a contact epistemology.
It's a contact epistemology. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But if we could know it, if we could know the far reaches of it, if we could know its form, then we might know ideally and optimally how to interact with it in such a way to grow it most, to grow it best, and to be true to it, and how not to pollute it and how not to contaminate it. And, and I think for every specific relationship, whether it's a very intimate, close one, or whether it's a fleeting one at the brewery that you had, or, it's like there already is a set of constraints. And if I can really attune to what those constraints are, I will know how to respond to them. And responding to them is going to produce a specific version of me. And that version of me is going to be like a vessel of play. I'm going to have an ironic relationship to that vessel of play because it's going to be in response to a specific set of conditions. I won't confuse it for the whole of me, whatever the heck that is.
Right.
It's no kind of person I know. But I'm going to be able to play it out in that particular arena. And then it becomes an exercise, then it becomes a game. And if I understand it that way, I can relate to it properly. And if the other person also understands it that way, well, then we really have something interesting going on, even though that doesn't always happen.
Yeah. Wow. That was beautiful. Yes. Yeah. It's you can't fit into a place until you know you can't fit into a configuration of space available until you know what that space is.
Right.
So there's a certain receptivity that's required at the outset, but which requires the humility. Like you can't get started until you have humility operating. Yeah. But then there's a moving into the space, which requires almost a deeper level of humility because you're no longer just receiving, but you're actually shaping into. And there's a necessary acknowledgement of finitude there, right? Because if you're attempting to grasp out to the whole, like you'll never fit in, because even if you could grasp the whole isn't available to you. And maybe this is part of that. I don't know. There's this thing about irony that's sort of floating back here in this, and you brought it up. I mean, that the irony of becoming that vessel or playing through that vessel, maybe that's how you said, like being that vessel of play, but in an ironic sense. That allows you, I mean, is this the Night of Faith? Like, is this Kierkegaard's Night of Faith? Where there's sort of this, like, I guess I'm getting this, like, this infinite resignation of receptivity, such that you, like, Like when you're in the place of infinite resignation, you can actually see what the shape available to you is. And then the movement of faith is then moving into that space. But from, I don't know, is that, how does that?
Well, I mean, that the knighthood of faith would be past the point of irony, right? Like you would have left the irony behind. Irony is, I think of it almost in the sense of like what irony does is it spatializes, it creates the necessary sense of inward space and separation to
Okay.
be able to not confuse yourself with objects of identity that aren't actually grounded in the deepest form of realness.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But in some sense, a knighthood of faith and the act of faith is almost like a I think of it almost like a conjunctio. It's like a rejoining. It's a collapsing back in together of those things that were made separate by irony in such a way that they are lived with a view to what's most real, that you live through. It's a hard thing to describe, but in some sense, I think the knight of faith would be able to go and just have all of these interactions, all with all manner of people in all manner of places, with a kind of equanimity that they wouldn't be having to play any kind of game.
Right.
They would,
which is sort of what you see.
They would simply be
Right.
singularly, and they would be able to act freely and wisely in each of these interactions,
Mm-hmm.
none other than they are, and be known and allow themselves to be known by that person in such a way that they could know them as fully as possible. And
because there's an opening from the ground of your being that starts it.
Yeah. I think that's a good way of putting it. Yeah. It's like Kierkegaard has this, I think it's this beautiful metaphor. This idea of like turning transparent, that the act of faith turns one transparent. It turns the self transparent, so that the thing that is at bottom within it simply shines through it. Right. And he uses the metaphor of a sentence, just a semantic metaphor, right? And when a sentence is coherent, you read through it, right? It's a transparency opacity shift, I guess, to use the Apter language, right? It's like and when we are in despair and double-minded, when we fan out into multiples, we are opaque to ourselves. We obscure the very nature of the thing that we are. We occlude the intelligibility that we have the capacity to emit. Like the way that like what happens to a sentence when the sentence is not in semantic order, right? And if we arrange the grammar of that sentence into its proper coherent structure, the sentence is the conduit for the meaning.
Yeah.
Because it turns transparent in effect. And I think for him, that's the project of the self, is to bring itself into coherence, to bring itself into unity, such that it becomes a means of conveying the thing that it is. Right. And so I imagine the Knight of Faith would simply be like a very, very coherent sentence. It would read very plainly, very simply, and quite perfectly. In the way that the greatest pieces, like the greatest things I've ever read, the most profoundly beautiful things I've ever read, have absolutely been the simplest. Absolutely been the simplest. And I imagine that the most profound interactions in some ways I've also ever had have been the simplest. They haven't come on the heel of deeply, deeply complex philosophical discussions.
Yeah.
have come
Yeah.
on the heel of deep, simple expressions of relationship. That's it. That's it. It's not to say that complex philosophical conversations don't have value, because clearly when we're undertaking them all the time, there must be something necessary about them. But they are
Whether
a
we're foolish or
particular
not.
they are a particular kind of game
Yeah.
to stir a person's relationship with what it is that they believe, how it is that they feel, right? To develop that axis, to develop a conversant relationship with what it is that's making its way through me, that needs to be settled and brought into coherence and given a semantic linearity so that it can be read and known to me and to anyone else. And so much of the tangle of ideas and all of their complexity is a venture to find their way back to simplicity and to unity. And I think that's what is going on in Kierkegaard, which is something that you mentioned earlier, which I think is quite right. And I think in some ways it's the purpose of a lot of what we're doing, is to use this deeply, deeply entangled cluster of ideas, and we're trying to sift, and we're trying to sort, and we're trying to find where the relationship is, where the heat is.
Yeah.
Right. And that involves a lot of experimentation, and it involves tumbling and tumbling and tumbling and tumbling. And it also involves tumbling over a lot of conversations that we might regret, I suppose, but that have had us investigate the multiples of what is produced from us when we come into contact with people. And by investigating those multiples, we might begin to develop the ironic sense that there's something in the multiples that is tending, yearning, thirsting for something unified again.
Yes. And I find myself dragged in sometimes to the complexity, almost at my own, against my will. But it happens as a consequence of uncovering something about myself that's been unconscious, something that's been sort of unconsciously driving me. This is what has happened for me, especially over the past like 8 or 9 months, with the notion of freedom. It's like, I started to read D.C. Schindler's book on freedom, and I suddenly came to realize that I had been unconsciously operating a massive tangled web of complicated machinery that was driving my life in ways that didn't seem to be wise. And so, and hence I've embarked on a complicated disentanglement. But when it loses sight of the fact that it's ultimately towards something deeply simple, I think that's you get into trouble then.
Well, you're in good company, I think, because there are these deep structures of belief that move us and steer us. And by belief, I mean like the structures that we live out, the structures that we take, the models of reality that we take to be true, and that predetermine the number of constraints that we actually spy out in the world and in our lives. And they may or may not be necessary, strictly speaking. And one of the things that is very helpful about, philosophical discussions, let's say, especially in the dialectic. And the dialectic, I think, tries to deliberately take this and structure it in a way as to produce these insights. But even if it happens more haphazardly, one of the things that happens when you get into a philosophical discussion in which you have to give voice to ideas is that the structures of belief that actually guide your behavior suddenly actually become available to you for examination, especially when they're involuntary. And that's why I think, going back to the earlier part of our conversation, sometimes it is important to tumble foolishly into difficult conversations and to regret them afterwards, because what you discover, and what I certainly discovered, is that there are beliefs that you have that you didn't know you had, that were invisible to you, transparent because you see through them. And all of a sudden they've been made they've been given some opacity by a conversation in which you said something that you thereafter can't make sense of and don't know why you said, like a Freudian slip, you know?
Yep.
And now you have to reckon with the fact that you were not yourself in this moment. And what does it mean not to be yourself? And suddenly you realize that you're living in these multiples created by a refracted view of what you actually believe in the first place. And now what you have to do is go tend to the source of that dissonance and figure out, why did I say this when I don't think I believe it? Maybe I do. What does that mean? What does it mean that I said this and shouldn't have, or I did say this and should have?
Yes.
Like, how do I make sense of that conflict now?
Who must I be in order for this to be a possibility?
Right. Yeah. Exactly. And sometimes that only happens in like foolish, careless, reckless moments. And that's why foolish, careless, reckless moments are actually, you know, they have their place. They're not without value because they make the invisible visible in a Socratic way so that we can start tending to them. And we all have those. And so however shame, you know, now the problem, the contending.
Participate grace. How do you participate grace? Like, that's the thing for me, right? How do I participate? Like there's this ladder, right? Of like repentance, forgiveness, gratitude, grace, like in a Jacob's ladder of participation into that.
Yeah. That's right. And I think that grace, let's get back to the Night of Faith for a moment. Like that grace is a state in which the shame of an action measured by an ethical universal norm is surrendered and yielded up for the very thing that will be disclosed and made possible by that shameful act, when that shameful act was necessary for the disclosure, for the thing that is real to become properly real and known. Right. So to take that in micro, it would be something like this, you know, I have to say something awful and stupid and foolish. Let's say I have to do that in this very public way, and I have to be shamed for it. Now, maybe the shame itself is incidental, but the point is I have to behave in this public way. And in behaving badly or saying something very sort of, maybe I say something very, very stupid or very insensitive in this very public way. And what happens as a consequence of that is that I'm now very vulnerable to shame. I'm vulnerable to people pointing at me and saying, well, he's an idiot and he doesn't know what he's talking about and he's this and maybe he's not a very good person. And right, I have to open my up to a universal kind of shame, an ethical shame. But it might be that the only way that something in me could be made properly known to me was in making that particular error. And so suddenly there's a kind of developmental purposefulness, a kind of, and might have been unintended, but there's now a developmental value, an existential value in that error, because that error has now revealed something in my nature that has to be tended, that has to be addressed in order for me to come into a greater sense of unity, a greater kind of wholeness and oneness, in order to integrate properly. And it might be that the only way in which that would be laid bare and made known to me is in the most public of ways, is in a way that where the stakes were high enough to elicit the error and to magnify it in such a way that it could be reflected back at me so that I could grasp it. I'm so fascinated by the phenomenon of public shaming, especially that we're seeing right now. But I mean, it's not new. It's just has a new sort of medium and platform. But I find that interesting. And I find it interesting to think about what happens to the person when a person goes through that, when a person goes through a real public shaming. And I think that the Abrahamic story is fascinating because he undertakes to do something that would be the ultimate shame. Right? It would be the ultimate ethical contravention. It would be the ultimate
across context, across history,
anathema, right? The ultimate anathema in the eyes of the world. And he's willing to be anathema in the eyes of the world for the sake of revelation. And that is dangerous and absurd and incomprehensible, but that is the point.
Okay, so I'm sorry, but so here, like Abraham and Isaac, they're, at least for me, they're pretty clearly a type of God the Father and God the Son, right? And you know, the cross and Jesus are this, it's a stumbling block, right? It's folly. There's this anathema that happens with God the Father and God the Son in that cry, in Jesus's cry, my God, why have you forsaken me? Right? Like there's an anathema that happens where God where God the Father almost like opens himself up to that right, like God allows his son to die. And in a sense, right, like at least there's significant portions of Christianity that have spilled a great deal of ink trying to understand how it might be that God was actually, like the wrath of God is being poured out on Jesus. Like there's sort of that idea, at least in aspects of Christianity. I'm not sure what I think about it, but and like, is there something that God is doing there that we're I don't know how to ask the question. I know I'm sort of like blowing this up and throwing it in a different light, but there's something about that analogical relationship to me that's really just sort of yelling at me.
So you're talking about the relationship between Abraham and Jesus.
Well, the Abraham and Isaac analogically corresponds to God the Father and God the Son. And that
Right.
when Abraham goes to sacrifice Isaac, right, God tells him no, because he's gone as far as a human being can go,
Yeah.
right? You can't go farther than faith, and he receives his son back again.
Yeah.
But the ram appears in the bushes. There's a propitiation sacrifice that shows up to happen. But in Jesus, with Jesus and God the Father, it is in fact carried through. Like the sacrifice in some sense is carried through. Maybe and I'm gesturing towards Jesus's statement on the cross that my God, why have you forsaken me, as maybe even a way to support that there is this moment that God the Father, like he doesn't just draw the knife lands.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
And in so doing, like God the Father and God the Son become this anathema because they're sort of both the same person, and which okay, then let me take it one step further, which then provides the grace for all of the individual lack of participation with grace across time. And this is how Jesus takes on the sins of the world.
Right.
I know I'm doing a lot there, but
no, it's fascinating. I mean, this is like heavy theological stuff now. I mean, the short answer is like, I don't know, but the one thing that's so, I think I can only measure a reaction in detail. So in little details. So things like, one of the things, so for one thing, I think that the incomprehensibility of Abraham's intended sacrifice of Isaac, I think that if we try to comprehend it, in some ways we might be missing the point.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So it's tricky, right? Because the something is being presented which is in defiance of every ethical sensibility and presents in the absurd. And if we And if in examining the significance of that, we try to undertake a very, very close, if we try and make intelligible on worldly terms the action itself, the decision itself, we're then trying to tame it in a way that perhaps it is untamable.
Can't make a method of
have
it.
To, like, I feel like we have to, I mean this in you know the sense in which I mean this word, like we have to understand this mythically, right? We have to understand this mythically. And if we undertake the wrong kind of investigation of that, we risk trying to tame a mythic structure that presents in a way that is untamable. So that's one thing. Another thing is it's, I mean, the one of the differences in these two stories, in these two structures, is that in one case, on the part of Jesus, it is voluntary. The sacrifice is voluntary. And in the case of Isaac, it was unwitting and involuntary.
Yeah.
The role of the Father and the Son are collapsed together.
Yes. Nice. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
The worldly role of Father and Son are collapsed into the person of Jesus.
Right.
And his identity with the Father. Right. So the two roles are collapsed.
Yeah.
And there's now also a stricter identity with the Father.
Yep.
Even though they are technically different persons in the Trinity.
Right. But it's the collapse. Yeah. Sorry. Oh, there's a whole thing to go off on here about, I think, of the collapse of the two worlds mythology. I think that's the point. I think that's actually like the point of Christianity, existentially speaking.
Yeah.
But
okay. Oh, right. Well, it's yes, because it's the incarnation. It's the embodiment. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. I think Jonathan talks about that very, very well. Peugeot.
Yeah.
I think he's been I think I've learned a lot from the way that he's articulated that. What else is there to say about this? There's so much, but I want to, to be honest, it's a really good question, Ken, and it's something that I think I want to think more about. But I think that I'm fascinated by that detail, by the fact that there's, because I don't want to think of this in any kind of straightforwardly progressive, and you know what I mean. I don't want to think of this in some kind of straightforward progression between the testaments.
Yeah, it's almost like they're two ontological levels, like Abraham and Isaac is happening here, and then Jesus happens underneath that and gives rise to it.
I think that's a good way of putting it. Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. There's sort of like before
Abraham was I am.
There's a correspondence of structure between the levels.
Yeah.
And the correspondence of structures between the levels ultimately grounds in the same divine command. And something is yeah, I'm going to trail off on this one.
Yeah, that's probably a good place to stop.
I'm going to think more about this.
Yeah. Well, we have to stop at some point. So that, I mean, it's like aporias in a lot of different directions. I feel.
Yeah. But it's a good moment. It's a good aporia because it's one of those things about which there is so much to say and nothing to say.
And you know everything you say is going to be wrong.
And everything I say is going to be wrong. Correct. And sometimes I'm usually comfortable with that. And then there come certain moments when the prospect of just how wrong it will be seems so overwhelming that like a predator, it freezes me in my tracks.
Yeah.
And I'm frozen in my tracks at the
Well,
moment,
thank you.
Which is good.
Well, thank you for, as always, it's been a great pleasure, my friend.
The pleasure's been mine, Ken. Thank you.
Yeah. Until next time.
You bet. Until next time.